All right, folks, good afternoon from Youngstown, Ohio. Hopefully everyone is enjoying their day. Their week's going well so far. We are nice and sunny here in Ohio, about a brisk 41 degrees. Hopefully everyone's enjoying your day. Once again, I want to go ahead and welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. Again, my name is Stephanie Naum, and I am our Client Success Manager over here at Turning Technologies. And I'm going to be your host and your moderator for today's webinar. As I mentioned previously, we are so excited about our topic today. I know internally we are excited to hear about the content. So just a couple housekeeping things before we jump into the webinar. So I want to go ahead and discuss the format of the webinar and of course introduce today's presenter. So over the next hour, we really encourage you to submit any questions you have over to that chat or question box. So go ahead again in those GoToWebinar controls, go ahead and locate that chat or question box. Any questions that come in for our presenter, I'm going to go ahead and address throughout the webinar today. So if you have attended some of our other webinars and you know we typically hold all of those questions to the very end, today is going to be a little bit different. So I want you to go ahead and interact with our presenter, send comments, feedback, suggestions, questions over to that chat window. I'll go ahead and present those to our webinar at that time. So our live presentation today is going to be about 45 minutes. And again, if we have any questions that we don't address throughout the session, we'll go ahead and address those at the very end or via email afterwards. Now again, our presenter is going to be periodically in and out of the Turning Point software. So I did put that session ID at the very bottom of the screen. If you would like to join through Turning Point Mobile, you can go ahead and enter in that session ID. Again, in and out throughout the webinar, so I'm sure Dr. Sparks will let you know when that is going to take place. Now with no further delay, I'd like to take a moment here to introduce today's main presenter. Dr. Taylor Sparks joined the Materials Science and Engineering Department at the University of Utah as an assistant professor in 2013. He's originally from Utah and an alumnus of the department he now teaches in. Before graduate school, he worked at Ceramatech Incorporated on geopolymers, reaction bonded ceramics, and fuel cell insulation. He did his MS in materials at UCSB and his PhD in applied physics at Harvard University in David Clark's laboratory. And then did a postdoc with Ram Seshadri in Materials Research Laboratory at UCSB. Currently, he's the director of the Materials Characterization Lab at the University of Utah and teaches classes on ceramics, material science, characterization, and technology commercialization. His current research centers on the discovery, synthesis, characterization, and properties of new materials for energy applications. He's a pioneer in the emerging field of materials informatics. Data mining and machine learning are leveraged to solve challenges in material science. Dr. Sparks, thank you so much. It's great to have you with us this afternoon. Hopefully I didn't mess up too much on your bio there. Dr. Sparks, go ahead and possibly unmute yourself if you're still on mute.
Okay, can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, now we can. How are you this afternoon?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Can I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes, go ahead and give me 1 second here. I'll go ahead and make you the presenter. And you should be able to share at any moment you are ready.
Okay, can you see something now?
Perfect. We see your screen. Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the chance to be here. I haven't done a webinar format like this before, so I'm excited to try it out. I've been learning new things as I've been doing it myself. And so the title of my talk today was originally going to be PowerPoint is Still Evil, and how we can use flexible anywhere polling for dynamic teaching as an alternative. But I recognize that many people use PowerPoint, so I guess we could update this to say that dull presentations are really what's evil. And then just because you use PowerPoint doesn't mean that you're not instructing well, and just because you don't use PowerPoint doesn't mean that you're doing a great job either. That said, the standard for teaching with PowerPoint is pretty low. It's pretty bad right now. I can only speak for myself, but in the engineering and science disciplines, most classes where the teacher uses this as their primary means of instruction are really pretty bad. And just for some evidence of this, we're actually going to look at a few examples right now. All I did was I put in some sort of engineering topic, and then I put PowerPoint, and then I put like a .edu just to see what was out there. So I'm going to pull these up, and I'm going to ask for some feedback from you guys as we do so. So remember, what we're going to do is we're going to start up in the Turning Point, we're going to actually start a session which has some of these questions already pre-made. So I'm going to go to my content, and actually I'll be talking more about this, how I use Anywhere polling, but I'm going to be using Anywhere polling as I talk about what we're seeing here. So go ahead, get logged on. The response where ID number is A, then 2018-0418, that's just today's date. So if you want to, you can go ahead and log in, and I'm going to have you guys give responses based off of some of the things that you see in these PowerPoints. So I'm going to get this started. The first thing I'm going to open up is my PowerPoint, so bad.powerpoint, right? So let's open this thing up. Okay, so this was, I think I put in like fluid transport or something, right? And when I open this up, what I'm going to ask you guys to be responding with as we do this is I'm going to ask you to respond with what observations do you have with so bad.powerpoint, right? So at any given time over the next minute or so as we flip through these slides, I'd like you to type in what you see. What will pop up is basically the first two sentences of what you type in, since I've set this type of question to a short answer. So if you look at this, what the professor's done, right, is he's basically taken the chapter in the book that he's using, and he's regurgitating it for them, right? He's got lots and lots of text. He's using some of the figures. He just keeps on adding more and more information. This is a very top-down sort of way to instruct. There's 100 slides of this, and we're not going to look at all of them. But this is basically what it is, right? He introduces equations. These are already completely done. I imagine this person's just sort of talking through them. And this is, unfortunately, a pretty common way that you'll see engineering topics presented. So if you've got a second, go ahead and type in some responses on, if you're a student, particularly or if you're a faculty who cares about active learning, what are you observing here, right? What sort of feedback do we get from this? So give it just a second for people to click in some responses. You could use the chat window as well, I suppose.
Yep, Taylor, we're getting a few through the chat window. A lot of people are saying very text heavy, a little bit unorganized. So just some things that are coming through the chat window there.
Perfect, yeah. So I'll go and close this. Looks like we've got like one response, yeah, and unorganized, right? This person, you're absolutely right that this is coming across as very unorganized. I thought the same thing, and it's a ton of text. So as you're presenting this, all of us that are here today, we care about active learning, or you wouldn't be here at all. So you're losing students because he hasn't put in a single sort of reflective question. He hasn't had any activities. This is just regurgitating. They could have just read the book and got the same exact outcome. So let's go to our next topic. Right, this next one is startsok.powerpoint, right? And if we go to this one and fire it up, what you're going to see is just like the label suggests, right? This starts out with some right approaches, but then they lose it, right? So it's about food processing. They dive into showing some interesting images. They start out with this great question, right? This great interesting comment where it says, people today, we've never seen consumers as confused as they are today, which is a great way to engage your audience, because you could have follow-up questions like, what does it mean to be GMO or not GMO? What does it mean to have, like, we can all relate with that. And so I think that the instructor's done a good job starting here. And if you follow this, they've done some basic things, lots of images, like, can you spot the foods that are processed? He's asking the audience for participation here, right? So they've done some good work in the beginning, but 4 or 5 slides in, I guess 9, 10 slides in, and it's already devolved to what we saw in the previous presentation, where it's essentially the textbook being regurgitated. There's not many callouts or opportunities for students to be involved here. So again, if we look at the responses, if we were to start this next one, we could have you say, well, what responses do you have in starts okay? I imagine it'll be similar things we've been talking about. So if you want to enter a few responses, we'll chat about those. All right, some kind soul is responding to these, so I appreciate it. I'm just going to wrap this one. And they say, yeah, they would like more images, that this is really text heavy. I would agree that it tends to be pretty text heavy, and that might be how we learn to process it well, but we're going to talk about different learning styles in just a moment, right? So we could go on. I don't think I'll do all of these, but we could go on. Let's just do the next one, so ugly, right? This one's actually kind of interesting. So if we open up the so ugly PowerPoint, this is kind of interesting. What you see is, in fact, it is super ugly, right? The slides here, I find them ugly. But if you dig into it, it's actually not terrible what they've done here, right? This is pretty simple, just a few key statements on these things. here's a question, like it's something that the students can relate with, right? Cup of coffee and a popsicle are left on a table. What's going to happen, and then why? That's something you could very easily say, turn to a neighbor, explain what's going to happen, and help me understand what's going on, right? So you can be entering your thoughts and observations on this as we go, on what's happening in this so ugly PowerPoint, right? As it goes on, he's going to introduce 3 key concepts in this lecture on heat transfer. He goes on to explain them. These things are visual, like if you actually click play in animation, stuff is happening, so they can sort of follow onto it. I don't love the style here, but at least it's not quite as bad as the ones that we've seen. And then best yet, at the end of this, it's not very long, first off, and near the end, you get to, at the end of the class, he's built in some actual questions, right? Some basic concept follow-along questions, right? He's built in, I think, 4 or 5 of these, he or she has. So, I mean, we could imagine that the sort of feedback I would give this person is like, hey, it's great that you've got these sort of feedback questions. I would have interspersed them a little bit more or made sure that I had opportunities for people to be following along. But this is better than some of the other ones I've seen. 23 minutes, if that's a 50-minute class, that means that he's taking time to interact with the class and he's not just plowing through slides as well, right? And we could go on. And there's just more and more examples of this, either slides that are completely filled with tables or otherwise just very, very hard to have students be actively learning in, right? So there's problems with PowerPoint, and I don't think anybody's going to disagree that it can be done wrong. So can it be done right? For sure. And using clicker technology is one great way to do so. You can embed these questions right in there. It sounds like I'd say 90% or so of Turning Tech users probably used their questions built inside of PowerPoint. But that's not something that I've done because my experience in grad school was I didn't want to teach the same way that I'd been taught because I didn't think that it was particularly great because you saw so much just boring PowerPoint lectures that I wanted to do something else. So my primary vehicle that I use is OneNote, what I'm using right here, right? And maybe you've seen it. OneNote's great, but then the question is, how do you incorporate active learning in something like OneNote, right? As far as I know, Turning Tech doesn't have like a module that embeds into it. So what do? Well, anywhere polling is a great alternative. One question I'd like to ask real quick while we're here is, and this we're going to make a clicker question out of it. Let me advance ahead. Past these ones. I think it's question number 7. So on this one, this question I have for you is, how long does the average university student pay attention, right? So go ahead and take an answer this if you can. Is it A, all class long because you're an amazing lecturer? Is it B, about 15 minutes? C, 10 minutes? Or D, is it less than 5 minutes? So take a stab at what you think this is. How long does your average student pay attention? So when you start the class, you say, okay, everybody listen up, let's get started. And you start diving into what you're sure is just a wonderful lecture. How long do you actually have their attention for? So we'll give it just a second more.
Taylor, through the chat window, we are getting a couple people thinking 15 minutes, a couple people thinking option D, one person option C. So we're all across the board in the chat window.
Okay, fantastic. Sounds like similar things we're going to come through here. Yeah, people think either maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. So people have actually done studies on this. One of the very first studies was a guy in medical school, and it was really qualitative and it was a bit subjective because he would just lecture and then he would turn around and he would sort of like look around the room and see who looked like they were awake and engaged, and he would sort of ballpark an estimate there. That's not very great, but this is what he found, right? That's this plot on the left here with the blue curve. He said the relative attention seems to be at a maximum, maybe 10 minutes into the lecture, and then it steadily declined, was his sort of very qualitative approach, right? There have since been like clicker responses that have studied this much more carefully, and they basically show that from the time that you ask like a clicker question where they know it matters, if you tell them, for example, that it's worth points, you get high participation. And then if you do other things that aren't worth as many points or aren't worth points at all, you see this like dramatic drop off in people paying attention. And it's not until you tell them that it's worth points or that it's going to be on the midterm or something that you see it rise again. And basically what they're arguing, and this has now been collaborated by a number of different studies, is that you really only have people's attention for less than 5 minutes. If you don't break it up and do something to recapture that attention, then you lose them after even 5 minutes. And if we're honest with ourselves as educators, I think we've all seen this, right? So if I'm using something like OneNote and I'm lecturing and I've got bits of information, how do I still capture their attention, right? So anywhere polling is a great way to go. Anywhere polling is exactly what you're seeing me use here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this one right now. Yeah, I'm gonna end it. If this was a class, you could choose to save it, right, and save all the information. Doesn't matter for this. But anywhere polling, it's simple. You go to your content. And I'm going to show you how to do this in a minute. You can generate a class, right, with your question list. And when you're ready to present, all you have to do is select that class, whichever one you wanted to do, select the students that are involved in it, and hit go, right? It's very, very simple. So this actually is not hard to do. But what it allows you to do is, as you saw, once I have this thing ready, I can just hit go, and it lives up on the top right-hand side of my screen, or you can move this wherever you want. You can make it bigger and smaller. If that's too big for you and it's occupying too much space, you can actually shrink this and make it just go away until you're ready to present. But it's nice that it gives you the flexibility to pop it up whenever you need it, right? Now, if you don't use PowerPoint, what other options do you have? There's two great ones that I've seen people suggest. The first one is called Notes with Gaps, and the second one is a flipped classroom. People are probably familiar with what a flipped classroom is, but Notes with Gaps, I don't think a lot of people have seen that done very well. I'm going to show you just one example from a class that I teach, which is an introductory material science class, right? If I go to one of these lectures, right, of all these ones I teach, what I like to do on a typical class period is make sure that you start with some learning objectives. Tell them, right, these are the things that I really expect us to all know how to do by the end of this class, right? And I actually walk through these briefly, but I actually take the time to walk through them, and I'll try and circle back to them in the last 2 or 3 minutes of class to say, so do we have these? And if you don't have questions, I provide information for resources in terms of TA or when they can contact me. But what the Notes with Gaps really does is you just put a bare bones skeleton version of the chapter or the content that you want to cover here, right? So for example, I'm going to talk about phase diagrams. One of the very first things I'm going to do, I put in big red bold text this group activity, and I ask a question: why do we care about phase diagrams as engineers, right? What I'm forcing myself to do as an instructor is stop and tell them, turn to a neighbor, right? I want you to think about this. I ask them to tell their neighbor, why should we care about phase diagrams? This is obviously much, much better than just cold calling a student in the class saying, Brian, tell me why phase diagrams are important. Because if Brian hasn't done the reading, all of a sudden he feels uncomfortable. No one likes to get cold called on if you don't have the right answer. But it's much easier to respond if you've had a chance to sort of discreetly try this out with a friend or somebody sitting next to you, right? So you can do the same thing. You can pose specific scenarios. What would happen under this sort of scenario? But again, the key thing for me, at least in my opinion, to make sure I do this, I actually have to write it out that now is a group activity. I make sure that I can't miss it. Otherwise, our default is just to lecture endlessly without giving them a reason to recapture interest. Now, in the Notes with Gaps thing, first off, you can build in demos right when you're going to do your demo, and I actually will stop my demonstration or my presentation and do the demo, come back in, and I usually ask lots of questions about it while it's happening. But ultimately, what you want to achieve is something like this. You want to leave big gaps where you show, like you could draw the phase diagram for water, for example, right? In the phase diagram for water, as you plot, say, temperature versus pressure, you can show that the phase diagram looks like however it is, that there's different phases, right? That you've got basically your gas phase up here, your liquid phase, and your solid phase. I like to leave gaps in here because what this allows you to do is capture student interest. They know that these are the notes that they could potentially have homework questions on or tests on, but they're paying attention because you've left it blank. So they, either on their PDF or maybe they printed this out ahead of time, they're now filling in this gap, but they're not wasting their time writing out the stuff like this that doesn't really matter. So you're saving them time, which saves you time in the class, which allows you to spend the time on the concepts, but you're forcing them to be engaged because here's where you're actually describing something, right? And you could put different points on here and ask questions, at point A versus point B versus point C. You could ask questions, that are related to your field or whatever, right? So I make the point to actually build out this sort of skeleton version of my lectures ahead of time because it allows me to engage them constantly and constantly have class activities. Again, I build in clicker activities as opposed to group questions where you actually ask it's typically what I do is numeric response or multiple choice answers. Again, but forcing yourself to build these in and then having gaps where if you're going to derive an equation, that's fine. You can derive an equation, right? We know that free energy, for example, is equal to enthalpy minus the temperature times entropy. So if you want to do the derivative, you can do that here, right? You know that H is equal to its expression. You can combine these things, but your calculations are all going there, which is causing students to be paying attention. So this is the Notes with Gaps approach, and I think it's a pretty good way to go. If you don't do Notes with Gaps, you can also do a flipped classroom, which is, people have seen that. You're going to screen capture yourself, And then what's great is that you can use the polling anywhere. You could sort of ask whatever question you will, and during the class period, maybe you had 10 minutes to answer that first question. You've just got to open for the first 10 minutes while you walk around the room and have students respond with whatever content they might be interested in. Are there questions so far, Stephanie, or can we move on?
I actually do have one question that came through. I'm going to kind of paraphrase it for you.
Okay.
But a question came through about the PowerPoint. So this particular instructor says the students love having the PowerPoint before or afterwards. So since you're not using PowerPoint, do you give your students copies of these notes? What resources do you give them?
That's a really great question. So I'd say it's up to the different professors what they'd like to do. I heard the same thing, that students really want something to follow along with. So what I do is here in OneNote, and you could use whatever you want. I'm not like advocating OneNote is the best solution. As you just saw, it actually just crashed on me a second ago. So it's not perfect, but what I do is when I have something, I'll export it ahead of time, and I'll export it as a PDF, right? So you can take you can take your entire course if you wanted, all of your things, which you're not going to do, or just that day's lecture, and you can export it as a PDF and post that. That's what I typically do. And then a few years ago, I actually started taking the class lecture after I'd sort of scribbled on it, and I started posting those as well. And I said, if it's useful, here's my lectures with all my scribbled notes on them. And students really actually appreciated that. So they'll write down things that they see that I didn't write that was clarifying for them, but they know that most of my content will be written up there. It does you have to make sure that you're writing with legible handwriting, which is something we all face. But I think that's a pretty great way to go. And I also recently, in the last 2.5 years, I've started screen capturing every one of my classes. And then I make these available on YouTube. So I'm actually going to show you a YouTube clip in just a moment. But if you go to YouTube, if I go to, say, for example, my playlists, here's one where I've just worked out problems, but you could do the same thing for other things, right? My Introduction to Material Science class, every one of my lectures is all just right here, right? All, like 30 of them, I guess, 37 of them, they're all here. And I'm surprised, I thought this would be a little bit gimmicky. I'm surprised how interested students have been in having these available and how much viewership they actually collect. So students are actually going back. I'll say one thing, that if you are going to do something like this, something that I do that's been helpful is when I do these classes, I break it up, because this is 47 minutes long. And if there's just one little thing that they need to review, something that's really useful is to go ahead and create a plot like this, right, where you basically put a timestamp to the different segments that you cover. And if they just want to learn about thermal conductivity of polymers, then they can just jump right there. I guess since this is, it knows that I'm the editor, it didn't jump to it. But anybody else who saw this, it would jump to the video. Oh, no, it did. It jumped right to it for polymers, right? So I think that's one thing that I do, because I did get that exact same feedback, that people want something tangible to take notes along with, and then they want something afterwards posted. And so whether you do this in Word or OneNote or whatever else you do, I think that's still probably possible to do. Okay. So that's, I think, polling. I'd like to show you an example of how you build it, just because I think it's useful to see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the session that we have right now. I'm going to come over to the Content tab inside of my Turning Point Cloud dashboard. And if you wanted to create something that wasn't inside of PowerPoint, it actually looks pretty similar to start with. We're going to do a new, instead of doing a PowerPoint, which I assume how you do it for PowerPoint, we're just going to do a question list, right? So you click this. What it's going to have you do is give it some names. So, name it whatever you'd like. I'm just going to call it test, and you can give it, more info. If you have more info you want, you can be there. You can actually save presets, which in the past I've done. So if there's a certain type of class where I know it's going to be short answers, then you can have a preset where your basic question type is short answer. That said, you can change your question type for each individual question. You don't have to stick with this, right? You can change the number of questions. If you think you're going to have 4, but when you start making it, you really need a 5th one, don't worry about it. You can change that on the fly. So let's make our default be, say, numerical response. That's a common one that I do. We're going to make it only worth a point if you get it right, and no points if you get it wrong. Again, we can change that. And you can change even things like the font size, right? So now you're ready to get started. What you see is this. Now we're inside the content tab of this test session. If I double click on any of these, this basically is just like Word. All this text, you have all the editing features that you would need in like a basic word processor package. So you could say like, what will be the heat capacity? All right, I'm giving up here. at the Dubai limit. Jeez. Right? And so right now, since this is a numeric response, it doesn't have options for like multiple choice down here, but I can actually type in the acceptable range, right? So if the value is, you know, it's going to be something like 25 joules per meter Kelvin, since it has units, you probably need to tell them joules per gram Kelvin, I guess it would be. And you could type in the value, whatever it is, right? I can't remember what this value is. What's great is that you can give it minimum value ranges. All this should look familiar, I think, from the PowerPoint approach. So if you are testing on numerical responses, you can actually have this all here, probably the same ways you've been doing it, right? So then you're done with that question. If you want to change it and put a timer on it, you can do so. If you can change how you see the response grid. That's all available to do. So this shouldn't be very different than what you've seen in PowerPoint. And if your next question you want it to be, say, a short answer, then great. You can put a short answer. You can put correct keywords in there. You can do multiple choice, which I commonly do. You can select one or more of these things to be correct. I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. So if you've ever thought, I'm not thrilled with how my teaching in PowerPoint is going, and I'd like to try something else out, I think Anywhere Polling lets you still be clicker, interactive, still integrates with Canvas and all these things, but is pretty easy to use. So that's typically how these things work. Okay. Let me just share. We're about half hour in, so I've got a few. Actually, it looks like there might be a question, Stephanie, or do we answer that one?
Couple questions since we're at a stopping point here. Let's see here. So do you have your students respond with clickers or mobile?
So I'm going to show you a few tips that I've learned along the way by doing this. I've done this for about 4 years now with Anywhere Polling, and I've learned a few things. And then I'm just going to talk about, okay, if we are going to use PowerPoint, how can we make sure that we're doing it the best way possible, right? So one of the first things that I really love about teaching that I didn't know when I first started this job is that you can teach in a lot of different ways, and that you should teach in a lot of different ways, even every single day, right? So if you have one class, something I wasn't aware of is that different people learn in different ways, right? You might be a really good auditory learner, right? You hear things and you just understand it. But many students really need visuals, or there's lots of other things, right? So there's people that have sort of studied this, and there's something called sensing learners, right? That's when they have to sort of sense it with their external inputs, right? See, hear, taste, touch, smell, right? They need those demos. They need practical options of it. There's intuitive learners, right? Which are sort of imaginative. They're looking for meanings. They're okay with abstract thinking. They like to work with concepts. There are visual and verbal learners, which I just described, but there's also obviously active and reflective learners. It goes on. There's two more. There's sequential and global learners, where context is really important, or order that you presented is important. And I guess the takeaway for me after I went to these workshops on effective education is that there's no one right way to teach. The right way would be to incorporate as many of these different ways of teaching as possible, right? So when you prepare your lecture, what this really means to me is build in redundancy, right? Make sure that you do jump over to Google Images and you show something, that you jump over to YouTube, that you bring up a controversial question and you ask them to debate it, right? That you have them try things out afterwards and do calculations. And one of the things I've had success in is actually incorporating YouTube into my lectures, right? So for example, a very common clicker question would be built around an interesting YouTube video. So I'm going to show you one example of this, right? So if I come over here on a class where I'm going to talk about deformation of metals, it only makes sense to introduce blacksmithing, right? So I would go to something like Man-at-Arms, and I'll give them the option on which one they want to have it be on. And they usually always vote for, like, this hammer from Thor, but it could be on a number of different ones. I've got a few questions ready in advance. Again, that my clicker thing would be hovering. I would have started this and it would be hovering up in the top corner. And as this guy's talking about how he made this awesome hammer, you can just pause the video and say, for example, right here, he scores it ahead of time. He scores this plate, he heats it up, and then he bends it in the middle, right? So I can ask them, like, what was the point of those different steps? And it could be multiple choice, for example, right? Well, the scoring is important, so it deforms along a certain path. Later on in the video, he's talking about TIG welding, right? So you can say, okay, what is TIG welding, right? When he actually goes to weld these things on, you can ask, what is TIG welding? How does it work? What's the point of the inert gas? So you're covering the exact same concepts that you would be covering in your classroom, but you're doing it with this really sort of fun background, right? You could talk about brazing, or you could show them brazing and ask how it's different than soldering, or how it's different than welding. And you'd be surprised at how much interest students really have in this and how engaging it is. For example, we talk about electrochemistry about a week before I get to this section in the class, and people generally think, well, I'm not going to work on batteries, so when do I have to actually care about electrochemistry? And then you show them that if you want to put really cool engravings on the hammer, like they do when they make this as a prop or whatever, this is all electrochemistry. They're oxidizing and reducing different species. You can see how they pattern. You can actually see the reduction oxidation happening right there. You describe what's the point of this vellum, and you see the finished product that you have this controlled oxidation, which causes this really cool pattern. So I found this to be a really great way to teach, is by jumping back and forth between things that they might kind of care about to teach the underlying principle that, at least in engineering, is easy to do in this context. Other things I've learned, again, is posting the notes before and after class with your scribbles. I've been surprised how much people really like that. Same thing with screen capturing your class. I think sort of injecting popular culture or current events is really great. So, for example, we talk about aluminum versus steel in vehicles. And we had this great case study where 2 years ago, Ford switched all of their F-150s to an aluminum body, right? There's some steel on that still, but most of the body components are now aluminum. We talked about what are the implications of that? Like, people have heard of that maybe a little bit, or there's at least current articles in The Economist, in Vox, in Ars Technica, places that you can have them read ahead of time and sort of come ready to discuss it. Another great thing I've learned over the years with using anywhere polling is that you can use anywhere polling for more than just concept checking and paying attention in class. You can use anywhere polling to give students a voice in directing or giving vision to the class. Now, you want to be a little bit careful what sort of things you let them decide on, and it's up to you, but I've had a lot of success in saying, would you rather, we're going to take a poll from students here, would you rather that we cover composites or say electronic materials for the last month of class, because we're not going to be able to do both, and let people vote, right? Or you could say, what day works best for a test review? Should we do it Thursday night or Wednesday night, right? And give them options to vote for. I think when students feel like they have the option to set some of the vision for the class, that there's better buy-in and more interest. So I've been successful with that. I would say to be generous with your in-class participation points. Your whole point is just to get them coming and paying attention. I don't see it as a really punitive way to make sure that they know, that they're getting right answers, because I really just want them to be trying things out and learning. But, it's up to you what you want to do with that. And then the last thing I've been doing in the last few years is I actually build in quizzes at the beginning of the class. So again, if you go back to like my Turning Tech thing, I'm going to close this one. I might have like 7.1, which might have like the content that I would have built into my lecture, but I might have like a 7.1 reading quiz, right? Or whatever it is at the beginning of class, which are very simple things to make sure that people did the reading. And that's actually been a pretty effective way to actually get students to do the reading, which in my case was always a challenge. They would come to class and they'd pay attention, but when I would ask them something that they should have known from the reading, it was pretty clear they hadn't done the reading. And this is a great way to, assign a few points to it, and they'll actually start doing it. Okay, so I'm going to pivot now, unless there's more questions about anywhere polling, and I'm going to talk, generally speaking, about, if you are going to use PowerPoint, what are some things that we can do to make it go smoothly?
Taylor, just a few questions.
Close.
Can you hear me okay?
And I'm going to jump to a presentation I gave on effective communication engineering. And these principles, they work for, not just teaching classes in engineering, or for communication engineering, they work well for teaching classes, right? So my argument in talking to this company was like, we all have busy schedules, right? Here's just a glimpse of mine at any given week. It's just slammed, right? So we can't waste time, right? And there's been some interesting articles written that basically show that if you're wasting people's time in a company, you're actually wasting huge amounts of money. We could say the exact same thing at the university. If you're wasting your time with a boring class, they're paying good money for that. Like, we owe them their tuition's money to provide some value and not just have boring classes, right? And they don't have to be bad. Some of the most interesting work or meetings, or even in classes, are ones where students are interacting dynamically with one another. They're brainstorming. Here's a group meeting where we did a hackathon where we were all actively learning a principle rather than just having one student teach it. So in order to achieve this, what do we need to do? So I would say that there's sort of three approaches when it comes to using PowerPoint effectively. The first one is you need to tailor your presentation to the specific audience. Don't just have a generic presentation that you use for everything. And I'm sort of breaking my own rule because I'm giving you one that was principally directed at a company, and I'm teaching it for educators, but I think it's the same concepts, right? Second one is you want to present in a way that maximizes audience engagement, retention. You guys know this. You know active learning is important. And the last one is prepare efficient presentation aids, right? So let's talk about this first one. A tailored presentation, you really need to first answer 3 questions. Where's the venue? Who's the audience? And what's my objective, right? So if this is a classroom, you know the venue, you know your audience. So there, what we really need to think about is what's my objective? Is it for them to learn some new concept? Is it for them to develop critical thinking? Is it for them to do, well, what is it, right? So have that determined ahead of time and build your slides around that objective. Don't just summarize the book and then get to your objectives, right? Make sure that the slides actually reinforce what you're trying to teach, right? And then I would say to strive to explain things just as simply as possible, right? Here's a bunch of journal articles in my field or near my field, and these things, they're completely Greek, right? Now, if you look at what they're actually doing, if somebody explained it to you in a simple way, it's actually usually not that complex. It's just the language and the jargon. You lose people like right off the bat before they can even listen to anything else. You've lost them, right? And this definitely is the case with slides. When you go to these, professional meetings, you'll see something like this, and it's not even uncommon, right? Just like Math-ageddon, just everywhere. It's not great. Instead, what you want people to broadly understand a concept, even if they're not the specialist. Let's say that you're presenting to engineers. You want everyone in the room to be able to understand broadly the concept, and this can actually develop a culture of quality, right? So this is Toyota. If you're not familiar with this, I think it's called the andon cord, this cord that you'll see all the way along. What this is in Toyota culture is that anybody at any given time can pull that cord and stop the line if they think there's a problem, which means that everyone, even the janitors, need to have some basic concept of what is quality, right? So they've strived to teach it so that everyone can follow it, right? Again, I would say an effective presentation, you've got this clear purpose and objective. You're going to identify what that is, provide a few key supporting arguments, you put the data together, you make the slides, and then critically, you need to practice this, right? I think something that gets missed is we forget to tell people why they should care about something. We just tell them what it is, right? As educators, we're certainly guilty of this. I can dive right into electrochemistry and how you make these calculations of voltages and what gets reduced, what gets oxidized, whatever else. But if I haven't stepped back and first told people why they should care about it, why I care about it, and why they should too, then I'm basically wasting my time because they're not going to pay attention. So I actually think that you should spend about 1/3 of your time really motivating why we care about something. And you could choose what fraction you think is appropriate, but I think it's about 1/3. Okay? So now we need to present in a way that maximizes audience engagement and retention. I've already shown you that attention spans are short. That's normally something I would show in this talk, but I've cut it out. One way that you can really capture interest if you are going to do PowerPoint is just put up one great big image and then just talk about it. You don't need to flood this thing with text. Put up one big image or maybe a really compelling question. You could say, Salt Lake's a beautiful city and we love living here, but sometimes in the winter we get cold pool inversion where this pollution layer gets trapped there. So what's the origin? Why does that happen? Right? That's a really compelling question that people will want to answer. You could say turn to a neighbor and chat with them about it, and then you can ask for people to give responses. This is a really effective way to go. Another thing you can do is use analogies and examples to other fields, right? So in my field of research, a lot of what we do is it's using big data to solve material science problems. So if I say, I'm going to talk about materials informatics today, I'm going to lose people because they don't know what that is. But if I say big data applied to material science is the same as big data in these other concepts, right? Netflix knows that if I watched all 8 seasons of Battlestar Galactica, that I'm probably going to like Firefly as well. And it's right? So we can do the exact same thing with material science is probably the argument I'd make. Or you could say the same thing with machine translation or customers also bought on Amazon. This is all machine learning. So they're analogies that people can understand. Again, I think that great big images can be really compelling to capture your concept, right? Here we were talking about how cold temperature can really wreck battery performance, right? And you could just give that title slide and exactly as it is, but without the image, and people may not pay attention. But if you say like, who here woke up this morning and noticed that their car didn't start very well? Or have you ever noticed when you're skiing that your battery dies on your phone really fast, right? All of a sudden people can relate to that and they understand, and you can say like, our research can potentially solve some of these problems, or it's going to help explain what's going on, whatever it is that you have to say about it, and you've captured their interest, right? Another really important thing to do is vary the tone and volume of your voice. If you're like me and you love to listen to podcasts, you'll find that good podcasts, hosts, they already do this. they're dynamic, they're exciting, they interject differences in the way that they present. I think I see a question, Stephanie. Should I stop?
Taylor, can you hear me okay?
I think I've lost Stephanie. She's sleeping somewhere. Okay, so you're going to vary the tone and the volume of your voice, and there's lots of great examples of doing that. And it really just comes with practice and a little bit of confidence. Okay, I think it's a great point to present an unexpected statistic, quote, or statement, right? Earlier in this presentation, I said bad meetings waste your time. But you could actually pull up a quote where some VP or executive said, a bad meeting cost at Nest, a big company, right, that make the smart thermos, it cost $50,000 to $100,000 in salaries, right? So you could then present like, how on earth does he claim that, right? And it would actually be an interesting discussion. So presenting some unexpected or controversial statistic, making sure that you have eye contact with your class. Like, this is an unfortunate but a very common practice where the presenter, whether it's an educator or at a conference, just looks at their talk and isn't even like looking at students or interacting with them. Certainly isn't stopping to allow discussion to build in. Something that I like to do is I'll use humor, but you got to be a little bit careful, right? So when I talk about big data and material science, I show this quote from Dan Ariely where he says, like, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it, so everyone claims that they're doing it, right? So interjecting a little bit of humor in your slides, I think, can capture some interest and wake people up a little bit. Another really great way to go is to add videos, demonstrations, and props. I try and do a demonstration, and I teach an introductory engineering class, and at least every other day I do a hands-on physical demonstration. And the days that I don't, I make sure that I have videos, right? When I talk about Teflon, PTFE, I can tell you that PTFE is really great because things don't stick to it, or I can show you a gecko trying to climb it, right? And say, actually, a gecko can climb anything on this planet, but it can't climb Teflon, right? And that's more interesting than me just telling you about it. Or if I'm talking about electrochromics, I could try and describe the opportunity, or I could show, from our lab, these are the things that we can do. We can make really cool signage and decals, right? And you've captured interest, right? So adding interesting video or demonstrations or props is a great way to capture interest. If you're going to talk about a website, rather than like talking about sparks.msc.utah, right, and describing it, why don't I just jump over there? You could just jump over to it and show how it functions. That works really well. And then, we've got maybe 10 minutes left. And maybe this is one of the few last points I'll get to, but using stories and narratives is actually psychologically shown to make people pay attention better. And the reason why is because it actually engages a different part of your brain, right? So they call it psychologically privileged. Your brain treats stories differently than they treat other streams of information. If I just put up a chapter of a book, right, that I scanned, your brain will interpret it that one way. But if I tell you a story based on it, that has characters, conflict resolution, that is completely different. So I'm going to show you an example of that, right? I could talk about hemodialysis in a boring way where they just describe how it works, why we need hemodialysis for treating our blood. Or I could tell you the background. I could say, I don't know if you know this, but modern day dialysis, the thing that we use when your kidneys fail, actually goes way back to the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands during World War II. It started out, they didn't exactly use state-of-the-art biomaterials. This doctor, he actually used an old washing machine, beverage cans, and sausage casings, and he tried to clean blood using that. And this was like his first machine, right? And the first 16 people that he treated all died, right? And then in 1945, at the end of the war, he treated a lady who, he revived that lady, and she had been comatose for 7 years. So, this guy who was at the beginning of it, he went on to say this. He's like, this is a researcher who's in this field. This is a direct quote. He says, on February 1st, 2007, I entered the world of in-center hemodialysis. The physician was now the patient, and not a very happy patient. Life suddenly was no longer good. I had to deal with fatigue, excruciating headaches, mild disequilibrium symptoms, and of course, very large needle 3 times a week. So I could have started my presentation saying, hey, we need better hemodialysis materials, or you can give some of the background as to what's the impact of the existing materials and existing approaches from a story standpoint, and people pay attention literally very differently, right? Obviously, when you're presenting, your use of body language is important. Actually, one of the more compelling people in modern society, especially in the tech center, is Elon Musk, right? But if you see him present, it's actually a bit painful to watch. He lacks a lot of confidence, doesn't really speak very eloquently. And so you can give good and bad examples of what to do. Obviously, if you don't know what to do with your hands, like Ricky Bobby here, just put them behind you, hold them down, right? So I think that rather than diving into this last part, I would rather open this up for questions. If there's anything I can answer about anywhere polling, about presentation techniques or things that we've learned along the way, or if you have things that's worked well for you, I think I'd like to open it up for that at this point.
Taylor, can you hear me okay?
So I'm trying to see this in the chat section. So it looks like somebody says, is this an old version of Turning Point? I'm unable to attend the session using Turning Point app. So I'll say the one that I'm using right now. Good question. I could pull it up and see. If I go to my Turning Point, when I logged in, I suppose it's got information here somewhere. Software. I don't know which one this is actually. Good to do a few practice runs ahead of time. So I actually practiced this with a few students to make sure it worked. That would be another good one to test ahead of time to make sure that it would work, though. That's one question people are getting. Other questions are, what percentage of the overall course grade do you use for in-class participation? So what I do is I set it at 10%. Where I got that number from is from a workshop on effective teaching hosted by two people. Name is Richard Felder and Rebecca Brent. They're out of North Carolina. I think he's at NC State. They put together a great workshop. If you ever have a chance to hear them speak, I strongly recommend it, or that you ask your dean to have them come in. They're not cheap, but it is, if you're like me, I had no formal teaching training until I got this job. And the first time I taught, it was a nightmare, right? I made all the mistakes. It's funny, these people, they put together a list of the top 10 mistakes that you might make as a new educator. And I'm going to read them to you. And you tell me if you've made these same exact mistakes. So mistake number 10 is, when you ask a question in class, immediately call for volunteers. Number 9 is, call on students cold. 8 is, turn classes into PowerPoint shows. 7 is, fail to provide variety in instruction. 6 is, have students work in groups but with no individual accountability. 5, fail to establish relevance. 4, give tests that are too long. 3, get stuck in a rut. 2, teach without clear learning objectives. And 1, disrespect students. And honestly, my very first year on the job, I think I did all of those, right? And then the next semester, I had a chance to attend their workshop on effective teaching and completely changed the way that I teach. And far from perfect, but I'm getting better every year. And now I have a rational method to keep on improving. So again, they suggested active learning be at least 10% of the grade, and that's what I've been using. I find that's enough to get people to come to class, take it seriously, and it still lets me assess their merit if they know content, like in an exam setting. Okay, other questions I got is, do the students participate in anywhere polling on their phones or their laptops? So I've had them do it on their phones or with the physical clicker device. I imagine there's also a laptop option. I'm just probably ignorant to it. And maybe Stephanie can fill in and say so if that's the case. I find that the phone works pretty well, but there has been issues where, for example, the device by device, maybe it has like a slight glitch. For example, some students say, hey, I'm trying to put the answer in and I can't actually put a decimal place in. So what's great is that with anywhere polling, after your session is closed, right? If I come over here to manage, I can open up one of these sessions and I could actually go back and I could edit the responses in real time. I guess I shouldn't show these because it has to do with student information, but you can go back and you can give that student credit, probably in the same way that you can with PowerPoint. But yeah, I suggest that they just get the app and save the money and not buy the clicker. Next one, people say, do you share the notes with students in OneNote or as PDFs? I've actually, one year I did it as OneNote, but I find most people don't have that, and then they have to get it. So you could make both available, I suppose, except that I don't know then what happens if you change it. You'd constantly be updating it, and it's a pretty big file. So I just think it's easier to do PDF. I export the PDFs and show that instead. And it says, not clear how polling anywhere works. Can you go over that? Let me show that one more time. Maybe we've covered it since then, but I'll show you it one more time. So with polling anywhere, I'm going to pull up my, my dashboard here. So I go to polling. Before class, you need to have your anywhere polling ready ahead of time, right? So content, I would have gone and I would have gotten some questions ready, right? If I go to my question list, this class I only had 2 questions, right? They were both multiple choice. I needed to set up the scoring, what's correct, what's incorrect, what are the points worth, do I want a timer? All of that needs to be set ahead of time, and we've kind of shown you how to do that. And then when you're ready to present in class, you select which class you're presenting to, right? In this case, we're just going to do auto, right? You select the class that you're ready to, or the session that you want to present, like the content, and then you go ahead and hit anywhere poll, right? And up comes these things. When you're ready to ask the question, like let's say you're scrolling through whatever your notes are, when you get to the point where you want to ask it, you hit this and up comes this. Now you'll notice that the size is a little bit crazy on these. What's happening here is that I have a high resolution screen. I'm going to make some space for this. A high resolution screen is a 4K monitor, and so it didn't scale with it, but you can change this in real time. You can make it as big or small as you want it to be by holding down Control and hitting the underscore button or the plus button, right? I can change these. So when I first pull it up, I might need to change the size, but afterwards it typically is the right size. When I go to the next question, yeah, it's basically correct. And again, if for some reason it's not, then you could change it, no problem. You have flexibility in whether you want this text to be larger or smaller. I must have set it to be smaller when I wrote this question, but that's all stuff that you can change. And when you're done, you just hit X, and if people had made responses, it would prompt me to have an opportunity to save those responses or not. So that's how you work with these. It's actually really straightforward and pretty easy. How do the students participate? Again, either with phone or with clicker, and I think they can also probably do it with a laptop. Okay, and then these were our questions from before. So are there any new questions that I can answer?
Hey Taylor,
We're
it's
ready to
Nick
wrap
from
it up.
TurningTechnologies.
Though we might have lost Stephanie.
Taylor, can you hear me?
Somebody says, I wanted to attend using the session ID, but I didn't know the process. Oh, okay, great. If you don't know the session ID process, I don't know how to show it on my computer here, but on your clicker device, you can either put in the physical clicker number, but then you have to be in the same room. For you guys that are participating over a webinar, what you need to do is this response where session, right? So when you guys teach classes, you can either, so I'm going to end this session, right? What you can do is you can either start a random session, right? It'll just randomly, when I hit start session, it's going to randomly create this number, and you just tell people at the beginning of class, this is our session ID. By the way, if you forget to tell them that and you start this, it will show up right here, right? It says your session ID is 150594. So just tell them either on your physical clicker, type in 41, or your session ID 150594. What I did to make sure that you guys could all have this done ahead of time is when I did this, I already had a session reserved, and you can just come up with any number you want for these. You can make your own, right? I chose today's date, right? So that's how I did that. That's how you know the session I need to log in at. Let's see, other questions? So Stephanie tells me that I don't hear her, but everyone else does. So I think we're good on time, if that's right. Stephanie, should we wrap it up here?
All right, everybody.
Muted.
You can hear my audio. I'm going to go ahead and apologize for the technical difficulties that we are experiencing over here. But I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And of course, want to thank Taylor for our main session today. You will be receiving a recording of the webinar this afternoon, so you can watch it again, share it with some of your colleagues. And it looks like Taylor is going to go ahead and put his contact information up on the screen there. Folks, once again, thank you for your attention today. Thank you for your support and interest of Turning Point, and we will hopefully speak to you soon. Thank you.